Hello, and welcome back to our podcast about Neville Goddard. I'm really happy to have you here again. If you watched the previous episode, episode 1, then you already know Neville's story. You already know who this extraordinary man was, born in Barbados, who met Abdullah and spent 34 years teaching that consciousness creates reality. And if you haven't seen episode 1 yet, I highly recommend watching it before this one, because over there I tell his whole story, who Abdullah was, and I introduce Neville's 7 fundamental teachings. It's going to make a lot more sense once you understand the context before diving into what we're going to talk about today. But anyway, let's get into today's episode. And look, I need to warn you about something. The title of this episode might sound a little strange at first. How to ignore reality to create reality. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? Like, how can you ignore something and at the same time create that very thing? But it's exactly this apparent contradiction that makes Neville's this teaching so powerful and so misunderstood by most people. Because when Neville talked about ignoring reality, he wasn't talking about denying facts or living in fantasy. He was talking about something much deeper and much more practical. And that's what we're going to explore today. Slowly, deeply. So grab your coffee or tea, get comfortable, and let's talk about one of Neville Goddard's most revolutionary teachings. Ready? Let's go. So, let's start from the beginning. What did Neville really mean by ignoring reality? Because here's what happens. When most people hear that, they think, oh, so I'm just going to pretend my problems don't exist. I'll ignore my empty bank account. I'll pretend everything is fine when it's not. No, that's not it. And Neville made it very clear that that's not what he meant. Let me explain it using his own logic. Neville constantly said, there are 2 worlds, the inner world, consciousness, imagination, and the outer world, the physical world, circumstances, observable facts. And here's the key to everything. The outer world is always a consequence of the inner world, always. Not sometimes, not in a few cases, always. What you see in your physical world today, your finances, your relationships, your health, your career, all of it is the result of states of consciousness you assumed in the past. Are you with me so far? So when Neville talks about ignoring reality, he's talking specifically about ignoring the external world while you are creating in the internal world. Let me repeat that because it's crucial. Ignore the external while you create the internal. It's like this, and let me use an analogy that makes it easier. Imagine you're planting a seed in a garden. You put the seed in the soil. You know that seed is supposed to grow into a plant. But in the first days, when you look at the soil, what do you see? Nothing. Dirt. Just dirt. Now, if you get obsessed with what you see, there's nothing here. This isn't working. I planted it wrong. And you dig up the seed every single day to check on it, what happens? The seed never grows. You need to ignore the external appearance, the empty soil, and trust the internal process, the seed germinating invisibly underground. That's exactly what Neville taught about manifestation. And you know what's interesting? Neville used another analogy that I think is even more powerful. He said the outer world is like a shadow. And you don't change a shadow by touching the shadow. You change the object that casts it. Think about that for a second. If you're in a room and there's a shadow on the wall that you don't like, you don't go and try to paint the shadow or push the shadow, or negotiate with the shadow. You change the object, you change the light, and the shadow changes automatically. The physical world is the shadow. Your consciousness is the object. When you try to change the physical world directly, working harder, forcing situations, manipulating circumstances, you're trying to change the shadow. It might work temporarily, but it's exhausting and it rarely lasts. But when you change your consciousness, when you change what you assume to be true about yourself, the physical world has no choice but to change, automatically. And here's the part most people don't understand. While you are changing your consciousness, the physical world is still going to show the old reality because there's a delay, a gap between the internal shift and the external manifestation. And it's in this gap that you need to ignore reality. Not because reality doesn't exist, but because the reality you see is the old one. It's the reflection of who you used to be, not who you are becoming. Make sense? It's like looking in the mirror right after changing your clothes. For a fraction of a second, the mirror still shows the old outfit. You don't panic thinking the clothes didn't change. You just wait for the reflection to update. In the same way, when you change your consciousness, you need to give the physical world time to update the reflection. And look, let me give you a real example from Neville's life that illustrates this perfectly. You've probably heard this story. I mentioned it briefly in episode 1, but now I'm going to tell it in more detail because it demonstrates exactly what ignoring reality means. 1933, the Great Depression. Neville was completely broke. No job, no money, no prospects. That was the external reality. But Neville desperately wanted to go to Barbados to visit his family. He hadn't seen his mother in years. He went to Abdullah and said, "Ab, I want to go to Barbados, but I have no money. I don't see how this is possible." And Abdullah told him something that changed everything. "You are already in Barbados." Neville was confused. "What do you mean I already am? I'm here in New York with no money, no ticket." And Abdullah simply said, "In your imagination, you are in Barbados. Feel yourself there, sleep there, live there internally, and the outer world will adjust." And then, and this part is crucial, every time Neville tried to talk about his external situation, about not having money, about the difficulties, Abdullah literally shut the door in his face. Why? Because Abdullah was teaching Neville to ignore the external reality while he created the internal one. It wasn't about pretending he had money. It wasn't about lying about his situation. It was about stopping the feeding of the state, "I'm stuck in New York with no money," and starting to feed the state, "I'm in Barbados, mission accomplished." And what did Neville do? Every night before going to sleep, he imagined himself in Barbados. He felt the tropical climate, heard the sounds, saw the faces of his family. He felt himself there. During the day, when he looked around and saw New York, saw his empty bank account, saw the impossibility, he ignored it. Not in the sense of denying it, but in the sense of not letting any of that change his internal state of consciousness. He held firmly to the inner feeling of, "I am in Barbados." And a few weeks later, a letter arrived, unexpected, from a brother he hadn't spoken to in years, with money, with a ticket, with everything solved. Exactly the way he had assumed internally. So let me summarize the principle here because it's important that you understand this clearly. When Neville talks about ignoring reality, he's talking about being faithful to your inner vision regardless of the external appearance. Look, you know when you're watching a movie and the main character is in a horrible situation in the middle of the film? Let's say he's broke, alone, everything falling apart. You, watching, don't panic. Why? Because you know the movie isn't over. You trust that things will shift. You remain faithful to the expectation that the story arc will resolve. Neville was saying, do that with your own life. When you change your consciousness, when you assume a new state of being internally, you are in the middle of the movie. External circumstances are still reflecting the previous chapter. But if you stay faithful to the new state, if you ignore the temporary external appearances, then the movie of your life will unfold until it reflects the new reality. But, and here's the big but, if you look at the external circumstances and panic or doubt or slip back into the old state, you reset the movie. You go back to the beginning. Neville said the manifestation of a desire is in direct proportion to the fidelity of your feeling. Fidelity, that's the key word. You don't need to force anything in the external world. You don't need to figure out how. You need to stay faithful to your inner state. Even when, especially when, the outer world is still showing the opposite. All right. But how do you actually apply this in practice? Because theory is one thing, but you need to know what to do, right? So let me give you a clear process based on what Neville taught. First, define clearly what you want. Not vague, specific. What would it look like if it were already real? How would you feel? What would you see? What would people say? Second, create a mental scene that implies your desire has already been fulfilled. Neville called this thinking from the end, not of the end. Don't imagine yourself getting the thing. Imagine a moment after the money already arrived. Maybe you're paying a bill without worry, or buying something you've always wanted, or talking with a friend about how your financial situation has improved. The scene must imply that the desire has already been fulfilled. Third, and this is crucial, visit this scene mentally every day, preferably before sleep. Why before sleep? Because Neville discovered that the state of consciousness you fall asleep in is extremely powerful. It's when the conscious mind relaxes and the subconscious becomes more receptive. Fourth, and here's where ignoring reality comes in. During the day, when you look around and see that the circumstances still haven't changed, don't panic, don't doubt, don't go back to the old state of consciousness. Acknowledge it. Okay, this is the old reality. This is the reflection of who I used to be. But I know what I'm creating internally. I'll stay faithful to that. You don't need to pretend the circumstances don't exist. You just need to not let them change your inner state of consciousness. Fifth, persist. Be faithful, no matter how long it takes. Neville always said, the gap between the internal shift and the external manifestation varies. Sometimes it's days, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. But if you stay faithful, if you truly ignore the external appearances and maintain your inner state, manifestation is inevitable. It's law, like gravity. Now let me tell you about the mistakes I see people making when they try to apply this. Mistake number 1, they check the external reality constantly. It's like planting a seed and digging it up every day to see if it's growing. Did it manifest yet? No? Where is it? Why isn't it here already? Every time you do that, you're feeding the state of it's not here, it didn't work, I don't have it. And then you create more absence, not abundance. Mistake number 2, They confuse ignoring reality with denying reality. Look, if your bank account is negative, you're not going to pretend it's positive and go out spending irresponsibly. Ignoring reality doesn't mean being irresponsible or irrational. It means, okay, today my account is negative. That's a fact. But I am not going to assume internally that I'm a poor person or that I'll always be in this situation. Internally, I assume prosperity and I act responsibly while the external change unfolds. Mistake number 3. They give up too soon. Neville spent weeks imagining himself in Barbados before the external manifestation happened. Most people do the exercise for 3 days, see no results, and give up. And then they say, it doesn't work. But it's not that it doesn't work, it's that they weren't faithful long enough. The plant was germinating underground, but they dug up the seed before it sprouted. So let's recap all of this. Ignoring reality to create reality is not about denial. It's not about fantasy. It's not about irresponsibility. It's about recognizing that there are two worlds, the inner world, consciousness, and the outer world, circumstances. And that the outer world is always a reflection of the inner world with a time delay. When you change your inner world, when you assume a new state of consciousness, the outer world will still temporarily show the old reality. And it's in that gap that you need to be faithful. You need to ignore the temporary external appearances and remain firm in your new inner state. Not because the circumstances don't exist, but because they are a reflection of the past, not the future you are creating. And if you stay faithful, if you truly live from the new consciousness, regardless of appearances, the external manifestation is inevitable. Neville lived this. Abdullah taught this, and thousands of people have proven this. Now, it's your turn to test it, to apply it, to discover it for yourself. Choose something you want, create the mental scene, visit it daily, stay faithful, ignore the external appearances, and watch what happens. This was episode 2. In the next episode, we're going to talk about another profound teaching from Neville. Everyone is you pushed out, what it really means and how to apply it. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and more importantly, leave a comment telling me, have you ever tried ignoring reality to create a new one? How was it? What happened? I'd love to hear your experience. See you in the next episode. And remember, stay faithful to your inner vision always.